Hi, I'm Dave. If you're new here, I review the books that I've been reading, mainly fiction. Good to have you here. So, there's this book. It's been banned more times than almost any other novel in American history. It's been linked, rightly or wrongly, to two of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century. Teachers assign it, parents protest it, teenagers claim it gets them in a way nothing else does. And yet, if you actually sit down and read it, you might think, this is it? This is the big controversial book? A teenage boy walking around New York annoyed at people? Today, we're going deep on J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. What it's actually about, why it made the entire adult world deeply uncomfortable, why it's been relentlessly criticised, and why, despite all of that, it might be one of the most quietly clever novels ever written. So let's get into it. First things first, who is this kid? Holden Caulfield is 16 years old. He's been expelled from Pensy Prep, which, for the record, is not the first school to kick him out. It won't be the last either. Probably. He's bright. His English teacher literally tells him he's one of the most capable students he's ever taught. But Holden doesn't care. He refuses to care. And that refusal is basically the engine of the entire novel. The book takes place over roughly 48 hours in December, somewhere in the early 1950s. Holden leaves Pensy early, before he's even supposed to. Walks around New York City, checks into a hotel, has a deeply awkward encounter with a sex worker, reconnects with an old girlfriend, gets into a fist fight, visits his little sister Phoebe, has a breakdown, and ends up in a psychiatric facility. That's largely it plot-wise. But here's the thing. The plot is almost beside the point. The book is entirely told in Holden's voice, in the first person, as a kind of retrospective monologue. He's recounting these events from a rest home or some sort of psychiatric institution through Salinger deliberately keeps that vague. And the voice is everything. It's rambling, digressive, self-contradictory, and bitterly funny. Holden repeats himself. He calls people phony approximately on every other page. He tells and all constantly. He'll tell you he doesn't have to bore you with the details and then bores you with all the details. He's on the surface, he might seem deeply annoying, and that is entirely intentional. Because Holden isn't meant to be a hero. He's not even really meant to be likeable in the conventional sense. He's meant to be recognisable, specifically recognisable as a certain kind of teenager, the one who sees the gap between how the world presents itself and how it actually operates, and finds that gap completely unbearable. Now, before we go further into Salinger, I want to make a detour slightly, because one of the best ways to understand why Holden Caulfield still matters, today, is to look at a character from a completely different era who is essentially his spiritual twin. So I'm talking about Angus Tully from Alex Payne's 2023 film, The Holdovers. If you haven't seen it, Angus is a 16-year-old student at a New England boarding school in 1970. He's been expelled from multiple schools before this one. And as we can see, he's intellectually sharp, genuinely. He's obviously bright, and he deploys that intelligence primarily as a weapon to deflect, to antagonise, to keep people at a distance. He's sarcastic, prickly, difficult. His rebellious exterior is a coping mechanism for something deeper, loneliness, and a real reluctance to show vulnerability. Sound familiar? One scholar who wrote about the film explicitly noted convincingly the connections between Angus Tully and Holden Caulfield, and they're not wrong. The parallels are almost uncanny. Both boys are at elite prep school, and they clearly don't fit into. They just don't fit in those schools, and both are too smart for their own good, in the sense that their intelligence has made them acutely aware of that gap between how institutions perform goodness and how they actually operate. Both use contempt as armour, and crucially, both are carrying grief that they have absolutely no tools to process. For Holden, it's Ali. For Angus, it's his father, who is alive but institutionalised and effectively absent. Angus is left behind at school over Christmas when his mother cancels their family holiday, stinging with abandonment. Like Holden drifting through New York, Angus is fundamentally a boy without a home to return to. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the Holdovers Catcher in the Rye deliberately doesn't. Holden never gets a Hunman, Paul Hunman, the classics teacher played by the great Paul Giamatti. In some ways, what adulthood looks like when Holden's worldview wins. He's a man who spent decades being right about the phoniness of institutions, never softened, never connected, and ended up completely alone. He's sharp, worldly wise, wounded and guarded, and neither he nor Angus can initially see how much they mirror each other. A particularly telling moment, Hunnam quietly realises that Tully takes the same antidepressant he does. It's never discussed between them, but it tells the audience everything about the tenderness that slowly becomes the core of their relationship. What the Holdovers offers that Catcher withholds is a resolution, or at least the possibility of one. Angus gets to see where the path leads if you let the wolves stay out forever, and he gets to choose differently. By the end, Tully essentially saves Hunnam from a version of a future that was closing in on him, and Hunnam gives Tully something no one else has: the frank, unsentimental belief that his history doesn't have to dictate his destiny. Holden never gets that moment. The book ends with him in an institution, cautiously optimistic, but fundamentally unresolved. And maybe that's the point here. Salinger wasn't writing a redemption arc, he was writing a snapshot of a particular kind of pain at its most acute. But the fact that filmmakers are still essentially writing Holden Caulfield 70 years later, just setting him in the 1970s, giving him a grumpy classics teacher and a snowy New England campus, that tells you everything about deeply that archetype that is lodged in our cultural imagination. The alienated, brilliant, grieving, impossible teenager who sees through everything and can't figure out what to do with that vision. Holden didn't invent that type, but he defined it, and we still live in the world he made. So to understand Catcher, it helps to understand the man who wrote it. J.D. Salinger was born in Manhattan in 1919. He was, by several accounts, a difficult and complex person. He served in World War II, and that is important. He was among the first troops to enter a liberated concentration camp in 1945. He suffered severe PTSD. He was hospitalised. He checked himself into a psychiatric facility in Nuremberg. He never spoke about this publicly, but many scholars argue that Holden Caulfield, this boy who has seen through the adult world's performance and is fundamentally broken by that insight, is in some ways an echo of Salinger's own post-war disillusionment. The novel was published in 1951, right in the thick of post-war American optimism. The 1950s were supposed to be the decade of prosperity, of conformity, of the perfect suburban family, and the American dream finally paying out. And here comes Salinger with a teenage boy saying, I don't buy it. All of you are phonies, and I don't know what to do with that. That was a provocation, and a genuine one. Salinger famously retreated from public life almost entirely after the book's success. He moved to rural New Hampshire. He stopped publishing after 1965, and he became one of the great literary recluses of the 20th century, which only amplified the mythology around both him and the novel. He sadly died in 2010, having published almost nothing for the last 4 decades of his life. There's something darkly poetic about that, actually. Salinger spent his whole career after Catcher essentially doing what Holden couldn't, retreating so completely from the phony world that he disappeared into. Whether that's wisdom or of its own kind of defeat is a question the book never quite answers. So okay, the controversies, because there are several layers here and they're all interesting for different reasons. The Catcher in the Rye has been one of the most challenged and banned books in American schools and libraries since its publication. The reasons given historically: profanity, sexual content, and promotion of promiscuity, glorification of rebellion against authority, themes of mental illness. Now, is there profanity in it? Yes, generally. Is there sexual content? There's a depiction of a child being sexually abused, briefly and disturbingly, and a scene with a sex worker that's awkward more than explicit. Is it promoting rebellion? Well, that depends entirely on whether you think depicting rebellion is the same as endorsing it. What's fascinating about the banning history is that it says as much about adult anxieties as it does about the book. Because what parents and school boards were really objecting to was a book that took a teenager's cynicism towards adult authority seriously. It didn't resolve it. Holden doesn't learn his lesson. He doesn't come around to respecting the phonies. The book doesn't punish him for his worldview in a satisfying, moralistic way. And that was deeply uncomfortable for a particular version of what literature, especially literature given to young people, was supposed to do. This is where it gets dark. Mark David Chapman, who shot and killed John Lennon in 1980, had a copy of Catcher in the Rye on him when he was arrested. He had written inside the cover, "This is my statement." Chapman later said he identified with Holden Caulfield, saw Lennon as a phony, and thought the book had in some way endorsed what he did. John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate President Reagan in 1981, was also found to be obsessed with the book. Now, and this is crucial, the idea that Salinger's novel caused these events is essentially indefensible. People with severe mental illnesses, who commit violent acts, have fixated on all kinds of cultural objects. Blaming the book is like blaming the mirror for the reflection, but it stuck. It became part of the book's mythology, and it meant that for a generation, Catcher had this, I guess, sinister undertone that it arguably doesn't deserve. What's more interesting is why disturbed individuals fixated on it. The book is, at its core, about alienation and about feeling that the world is fundamentally false and that you alone can see this truth. For someone already spiralling into paranoid or grandiose thinking, that's a narrative that can be dangerously warped. That's not the book's fault, but it's not nothing either. Now, we need to talk about the criticisms, and I want to be upfront here. I'm going to lay these out as fairly as I can, but I'll tell you now, some of these didn't land for me personally. I'll flag where they didn't. Because the interesting thing about the book is that the criticisms themselves tell you something about the reader as much as the novel. So the first one, Holden is insufferable, or is he? This is the most common complaint you'll see thrown in at this book, and yeah, I get it. I understand exactly why people say it. Holden judges everyone. His dorm neighbour is a phony. His old girlfriend is a phony. His teachers are mostly phonies. His brother's Hollywood career made him a phony. Almost no one escapes this charge. And for a lot of readers, particularly adults, coming back to it after a few decades of life experience, he can feel like relentless. And there's the hypocrisy angle. He criticises people for lying, and he lies constantly. He rails against promiscuity, but obsesses over sex. He hates people who show off, but is himself a chronic name dropper and a performer. Critics point to all this as evidence that Holden is just a self-pitying, privileged kid who lacks self-awareness. So here's my honest take though. I don't find him insufferable. Not even close. Because the hypocrisy and the contradictions feel to me like the most truthful thing about him. That's not a character flaw in writing. That's what a 16-year-old in a genuine psychological crisis actually looks and sounds like. The question isn't whether Holden is consistent, it's whether he's real. And to me, yeah, he is. But this is important. If you come to this book as an adult, or you've simply never experienced that specific flavour of teenage disillusionment, the irritation is, yeah, fair to say, completely valid. The book asks a lot of you in terms of patience. Some people give it, and yeah, to be fair, some don't. I'd say the second one you hear is that nothing happens. For a book taught in so many schools as a masterwork, the plot is, well, thin. Boy gets expelled, boy walks around New York, boy has conversations, boy goes home briefly, boy ends up in an institution. There's no real external conflict, no dramatic arc in the traditional sense. This one I think has more teeth. If you come to Catcher expecting story momentum, a plot that builds, turns, resolves, you will be frustrated. It's not structured like that, and it never pretends to be. Whether that's a feature or a bug generally depends on what you want fiction to do. For readers who believe a novel should move, this one crawls, and deliberately so. That's a reasonable thing to find satisfying. Thirdly, it hasn't aged well. This is probably the most substantive critique, and the one that's grown louder in recent years. Holden's alienation is very specifically the alienation of a privileged white male. He has money, he has options. His tragedy is fundamentally one feeling alone, not being structurally excluded. There's a whole genre of mid-century white male alienation lit catcher on the road, Steppenwolf, that some critics argue centres a very narrow experience, as though it was universal and then gets taught in schools as though it actually is. This is, to be fair, a legitimate critique. Not a reason to dismiss the book, but generally worth sitting with, especially if you're a teacher deciding what to put in front of young people. And interestingly, Holdovers quietly acknowledge this. If we look at Angus Tully, it exists in a world that includes Mary Lamb, whose son Curtis died in Vietnam, precisely because he didn't have the wealth to defer the draft the way the Barton boys routinely did. The film holds both things at once. Angus's pain is real, and it exists as a system that distributes pain very unevenly. Salinger never had to reckon with that. Pain did, and it makes the Holdovers feel more complete as a result. Okay, here's what I want to push back on all of that, because I think a lot of criticism of Catcher, particularly that Holding is a whining hypocrite reading, misses what Salinger is actually doing. And first, the unreliable narrator as the point. Holden is not a reliable narrator, and Salinger knows this. The entire book is structured so that the reader can see Holden's contradiction, even when Holden can't. His hypocrisy is not a flaw in the novel, it is the novel. We're watching someone who is enduring a psychological crisis construct a narrative of the world that protects him from having to confront his grief. Because here's the thing, the book's critics often gloss over Holden's younger brother Ali died of leukemia a few years before the novel begins. Holden adored him, and Holden has never, in any meaningful sense, processed that loss. Every time that, what we say, phoniness obsession gets really intense, Ali is never far away. The famous Catcher in the Rye fantasy Holden has, where he imagines himself catching children before they fall off a cliff, is explicitly about preventing loss, about not letting innocence tip into experience, about not letting another Ali fall. Read that way, Holden's entire worldview is grief in disguise. His contempt for the adult world is a child's refusal to grow up into a world where Ali can die. That's not annoying. In my view, that's devastating. And second, the voice is a technical achievement. Holden's voice is one of the greatest achievements in first-person narration. It sounds effortless, and that effortlessness is the illusion. Salinger calibrates that voice with extraordinary precision. The repetitions, the digressions, the way Holden will be in the middle of telling you something sad and then suddenly say, I don't know why I'm telling you this. All of it creates the texture of actual disassociated thought. It reads like a real person, not a literary construct. And crucially, the voice is funny, generally funny. Holden's observations about the adult world, the guy at the theatre more interested in seeming cultured than in the play, the way people clap at the wrong moments, the phoniness of Christmas as a performance, are sharp and often correct. He's not entirely wrong about what he says. He just can't do anything useful with the insight. Third, the structure is a trap and you're in it. Here's the meta layer. When you criticise Holden for being judgmental, for being a hypocrite, for being privileged. You're doing exactly what Holden does to everyone else. You're calling him a phony. You're dismissing him. Salinger constructs the book so that the unsympathetic readers essentially reenact the adult world's relationship to Holden himself. The book makes you complicit. Either you extend him empathy and understand why someone in his position might behave this way, or you judge him, dismiss him, and in doing so prove his point about the adult world. That's a generally sophisticated narrative trap. Not many novels, in my opinion, can pull that off. And fourth, Phoebe. Every conversation about this book that focuses entirely on Holden's worldview misses the emotional engine. Phoebe, his 10-year-old sister. Phoebe is everything Ali was. She's smart, she's innocent, she's ruling away no one else in the novel is. And the most important moment in the book, arguably the moment Holden's arc actually resolves, is when Phoebe insists on running away with him and Holden has to stop her. In that moment, he becomes the thing he feared, the adult who has to let the child experience the world, even knowing the world will hurt her. In the book, he watches her go around the carousel in the rain. He doesn't catch her. He lets her go, and he cries. And for once, in 200 pages, he doesn't explain why, doesn't deflect, doesn't call it phony. He just cries. If you read Holden's journey as going from a boy who cannot accept loss to a boy who finally allows himself to be present for it, that's a coherent, deeply moving character arc. It just doesn't announce in itself. And here's the thing. That carousel scene, as you can see on the front cover, and the ending of the Holdovers are doing something very similar. Paul Hunnam watches Angus finally get on a bus towards a future, knowing what it will cost to make that happen. Not quite sure what comes next. Two stories set 20 years apart in fiction, written 70 years apart in reality. Both about the moment you stop trying to catch the children and just let them go. So, is Catcher in the Rye a perfect book? No. Is it a dated book in some ways? Probably. Does Holden Caulfield get on your nerves? For some people, yeah, absolutely. For others, and I count myself here, it feels more like an old friend who you just want to shake by the shoulders. But here's what I keep coming back to. A few novels published 70 years ago still provoke this much genuine disagreement. Very few books still get taught, banned, debated, and misappropriated in equal measure. And the fact that Hollywood in 2023 essentially made a loving tribute to the same archetype, same prep school setting, same brilliant boy, same December desolation says something. Holden Caulfield is not a relic, is a template. One that writers keep returning to because the question at its core hasn't been answered. What do you do when you're smart enough to see through everything, but not wise enough to build something in its place? Salinger, he didn't answer that question. He just asked it more honestly than almost anyone before or since. If you enjoyed this, leave a comment. Did you love this book? Did you hate it? Or did it depend entirely on how old you were when you read it? I really want to know. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. As I was saying in these videos, guys, take care and happy reading.